Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Pack. I'm a second year Master's in Public Policy student here at HKS, and I'm doing research with Caitlin Dickerson, who I'm introing right now. So, Caitlin Dickerson is an award winning investigative reporter and feature writer for The Atlantic magazine. Caitlin has reported on immigration from 3 continents and dozens of American cities. She has broken news about changes in deportation and detention policy and often profiles the lives of immigrants, including those without legal status. Previously, Caitlin spent nearly 5 years as a reporter for the New York Times and 5 years as a producer and reporter for NPR. She's a Peabody, Edward R. Murrow, and Robert B. Silvers Prize recipient and a 3 time finalist for the Livingston Award. And she's currently writing a book about the systemic impact of deportation on American society and has been doing research on it here at the Shorenstein Center. So please give a warm round of applause and welcome to Caitlin for being here.
Okay. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to dive right in. So I'm often asked how I became an immigration reporter. It's not the most common job, and people are always wondering why I've stuck with this subject for so long. And so I usually, right out of the gate, just start by explaining that I grew up here in Merced, California. It's a farm town, the second largest hub for dairy in the country. Merced produces lettuces and nuts and fruits and vegetables. And so I think I grew up with a different understanding of the relationship between well established Americans and new immigrants than most people in the United States do, because I just saw it every day. On my way to school, I would pass by dairies and pass by farms. I might see people outside picking heads of radicchio, and then after soccer practice, go to the grocery store and see the radicchio there on the shelf. And so the connection and the symbiosis between immigrants and well-established Americans, it wasn't abstract to me. It was very literal. I understood how one required the other. So that's where my interest started. And then when I got to college, I studied migration and learned about the political structures, the racial structures, and economic structures that I had grown up observing without fully understanding. So then I got really hooked and started to cover immigration as a journalist. So I'm going to focus today on the global refugee crisis. As you may know, it currently impacts more than 1 in 100 people on the planet. So that includes 30 million children who are displaced from their homes, very, very large numbers that can be hard to kind of wrap your arms around and understand. As a reporter, I tend to use those numbers to just dive as quickly as I can into the human stories on all sides to help people understand what this all means. So I'm going to do that for you guys today. I'm going to introduce you to 2 refugees to begin with who I met last year in Poland. And though the mass displacement of Ukrainians following the initiation of the war between Ukraine and Russia and the refugee movement that followed is unique in many, many ways, I think that the experiences of these 2 people I met in Poland do actually a really good job of highlighting the inflection points in the experience of a refugee. So do they get access to healthcare? Do they get access to education? Do they get housing? Do they get legal immigration status? And these inflection points are relevant in the story and experience of every refugee. They show how whether you're successful or not on these metrics really influences the entire trajectory of your life and even your children's lives and children's lives. And the other thing I wanted to mention that I kind of came to realize as a college student, and that's been reinforced as I've been covering migration as a professional journalist, that was really compelling to me, is that I've seen again and again how immigration status really influences the trajectory of a person's life in a very similar way to that of race, of socioeconomic status, of gender. It's another systemic factor that I think is forgotten sometimes. So I've sort of dedicated myself to shining light on that. So the people you're looking at here are named Irina and Nikita. I met them in Poland a few weeks after the war with Russia broke out. So Irina had been a taxi driver in the Ukraine. She was the only woman she knew who had that job. She grew up the daughter of a taxi driver, and she just loved cars, fell in love with the gig, and so that's all she'd ever done. And she actually married one of her clients named Ruslan, who was a mechanic, and they had their son together, Nikita. So the war breaks out, and Irina panics, like just about everybody in Ukraine, doesn't really know what to do. She has an older daughter in the middle of the country who can't get to her because ATMs are shut down. The daughter can't get a bus ticket to get to the west of Ukraine. So she tells her older daughter to go and stay with extended family who are just a little bit east of where she was. Her older daughter proceeds to basically live in a basement bunker type situation for months with, very little access to fresh food and even light. I mean, hiding from shelling. And what Irina does is she and Nikita hitchhike with neighbors into Poland. Something you may know that's a little bit counterintuitive about refugee resettlement is that it's often the people who have the most resources who get to leave first. So people who have passports, who have money, who have connections to actually get somewhere. And that was very much true and clear in the early days of the war in Poland. Irina had arrived there with people who were a lot more wealthy than she was. And so even though I, got on the plane as quickly as I could, intending to go and stay in this home where 13 Ukrainian refugees had been taken in to kind of document what it means to be a refugee amid this global migration and refugee crisis, by the time I arrived, everybody was gone except for Irina and Nikita. Everybody else had the funding and the family connections and the passports to either rent their own Airbnb or apartment or to move on to wealthy countries where they had relatives. So Switzerland, some had gone to the United States, some had gone to Germany. And Irina and Nikita were still there. They were staying in the home of a banker and an author who agreed to take them in. And when I arrived, the homeowner, she said to me, what can I do? Irina's a working class girl. And it sounded like a pretty harsh comment. But sometimes as a journalist, when people are that candid, it's helpful because she was right. Every Ukrainian person was suffering in that moment. But she was right that the resources Irina arrived with, which included just $300, that was her entire savings, meant her experience trying to acclimate to Poland was going to be completely different. She did get a job, but she was making illegally low wages working in the kitchen at a private school. She's basically an undocumented immigrant. Nikita was also having trouble, so he was waking up in the middle of the night crying out for his dad. He wasn't getting good sleep as a result of that. He was getting into fights in school. So he was offered a spot at a private daycare that kicked him out because he got into a fight with one student. When I arrived, he was at a second daycare that had also offered him a spot, kind of unofficially, but he was on the verge of being kicked out of that school too. And he was a child who'd never been violent before, but he was frustrated because he didn't speak the language. He couldn't communicate with any of his peers. He was exhausted and he was scared. So legally in Poland, Irina and Nikita were eligible for 18 months of legal status under legislation that was passed in an emergency session of the Polish parliament. So that would give them access to, a proper slot in the public education system for Nikita, to medical care, to welfare benefits, to cash assistance, and all the other benefits that come with being a legal immigrant within the EU for that 18-month period of time. But another thing that people don't always realize about being a refugee is there's a lot of logistics involved. It's similar in that way to poverty in the United States. There's a lot of lines you have to stand in, a lot of paperwork that you have to fill out. And that really wasn't an option for Irina. So in the photo you see here where she's holding up a piece of paper, this is her route to work every day. She had a 2-hour commute by bus, and she had to drop Nikita off, then get to her job and get home. And she was so paranoid about getting lost because she too didn't speak the language that she wrote it down. And the offices where she had to go to actually sign up for an official government ID number and all these benefits I just described had hours long lines outside of them every day. She didn't have time to stand in those lines because she had to work to make her wages that, no matter how much she worked, she was never going to be able to afford her own apartment, but it was what she felt that she had to do because her 300 US dollars that she arrived with were gone pretty quickly. So I had a lot of questions about what was going to happen to Irina and Nikita. Were they going to be able to acclimate to life in Poland in the way that these other folks who they'd crossed the border with already had? Were they going to get a foothold in the country? Was she kind of going to remain undocumented and wait to see whether she'd be able to go back to Ukraine or not? Would her husband survive the war? Lots of questions about what's going to happen to them. And these are the things that kind of interest me. When I arrived in Poland, the border was sort of packed wall to wall with journalists, and people would just go and stand in front of one news camera and then another and then another and then another and then another. And a lot of the reporting tended to be around just the vast numbers of people crushing across the border. And that, I guess, was attractive to people covering the war and trying to give a sense to their audiences of its immediate impacts. But as somebody who focuses on migration, I kind of am more interested in not just the moment that one becomes a refugee, but the weeks and the months after, and what does that mean for the rest of your life? So by comparison, the next person that I'll introduce you to is named Nduka. He is from Nigeria originally, and he arrived in the Ukraine in the 1990s. He was a university student, but while he was studying, his father, who'd been paying for his education, died. By then, he had a Ukrainian girlfriend with whom he was in love, and so who he eventually married and had 2 children with. So he decides to stick around and make his life in Ukraine starting in the 1990s. When I met Nduka, I asked him what he did for a living. And he said, as an undocumented immigrant in Ukraine, it's not really what do you do for a living, it's what don't you do for a living. He would take on any odd job he could find. He would buy old shoes and clean them and try to resell them at a market. He was a mechanic, he was a handyman. When the war broke out, he was on a job just chopping timber in the middle of the woods somewhere. And so he was able to hitchhike to the border with Poland. But as you all may know, lots of people who were not Ukrainian nationals had a lot of trouble getting over the border, and that was very much true for Nduka. He was stopped and kind of marooned on the border for a 2-week period of time. He was rejected by both Ukrainian and Polish border guards. There are effectively 2 checkpoints that you have to cross through to actually get into Poland. Both sides were giving him trouble. He was being harassed, and UN workers who supported him, whom I interviewed later, told me just about one example I'll give. Somebody in line to cross the border took out their phone and pointed it at Nduka and said, "Look, they taught the monkey to speak Ukrainian." He said this was really nothing compared to experiences he'd had over decades of living in Ukraine. And we're talking about countries that are 99% white. In this photo, he's showing me the scar from an attack he experienced in the 1990s when there was a rash of violence against immigrants and Jewish people in Ukraine. He was hospitalized in a coma for a month during this attack, and a friend who'd been with him was actually killed. So he did eventually make it into Poland, but his prospects were very different. He was not legally entitled to that 18 months of legal status. He actually had 15 days under Polish law to get out of that country. The UN workers who shepherded him across the border and kind of gave him advice about what to do next advised him to try to get to Germany. It's considered to be the most sympathetic to, or the most open and kind of unscrutinizing when it comes to people seeking refuge. So his plan was to try to get to Germany. Didn't speak any German, didn't have any connections in Germany. At that point, he spoke Ukrainian, Russian, and English, but none of those were really going to be terribly helpful to him. But, he's going to try to get to Germany. And I said, are you worried about this? How are you feeling? And he's just kind of like, what can I do? So I tell all these stories not to, and I'm just reinforcing this point because it's an important one, not to suggest that anybody has it, quote unquote, easy as a refugee. Of course, that is not the case. To be forced from one's home, to have to leave loved ones behind, to have people you know and love killed is a horrifying experience for anybody, regardless of the funding or the passport that you have when you go through it. But what happens next in your life looks very different based on whether you're legally and kind of socially accepted in the context where you end up. I'm going to step back and talk about Poland more broadly, because what was happening in Poland was actually very unique historically for that country. And some of you may know this already, but Poland is not a place that has historically been welcoming to refugees, not, decades ago, nor in even recent years. So starting a couple of years ago and amid the war itself, the leader of Belarus, Lukashenko, had started encouraging Arab migrants and refugees to come to Belarus and promising to deliver them across the border in Poland. He was doing this to irritate Poland. Lukashenko is an ally of Putin's, and the idea was to give Poland a bunch of refugees that Poland didn't actually want. The president of Poland and the government in Poland had offered a few different explanations for why those refugees weren't welcome. But the most generous one was, and some of those had to do with cultural homogeneity and religious homogeneity, and were more pointed when it came to race and religion. But the most generous explanation for why those Arab refugees were not welcome was, it's nothing against you guys, essentially, but we just simply don't have the resources to take in, tens of thousands of new refugees per month. We couldn't possibly do that. And so Poland had gone to great lengths to keep these refugees out of its country. People were sprayed with water cannons. People froze to death in the forest in Belarus, including, children and at least one baby. So the Polish government went to very, very great lengths to keep these refugees out of Poland. And again, the argument is nothing against you guys. We just were a small country. We don't have a terribly strong economy. Yes, we're in the EU, but we're sort of its weakest link, and we can't take on a huge number of migrants. That argument reminds me of something that we hear a lot in the United States. And in fact, we've heard a lot in the United States historically, that, it's nothing against all of the people who want to come to the United States, and we wish them well, but we simply don't have the resources to take them in. And I don't say this to minimize the very, very real amount of resources that it takes to welcome newcomers into the United States and give them good medical care, hold detention standards, hold detention facilities to sort of humane standards, and help people integrate into society in a healthy way. I mean, the resources are absolutely massive. But what I'm pointing out is the sort of lack of debate and the reflexive way in which that argument is thrown out there without any real debate, without any real number crunching. And that argument in Poland, at the very least, was clearly disproven when you have numbers of Ukrainians who cross the border that are larger by orders of magnitude than those of Arab migrants, some of whom died trying to get entry to the country, that supposedly couldn't take them on, didn't have the resources to take them on. And by the way, I'll just point out that the media plays a role here, of course, right? So a lot of the coverage of this tension between Belarus and Poland suggested that Lukashenko was attempting to destabilize Poland by welcoming and encouraging Arab migrants to cross the border into Poland. And even just the use of the word destabilize is worth paying attention to and actually questioning, right? Because it presupposes that Poland was going to crumble under the weight of all these new migrants, when obviously that wasn't the case when it came to Ukrainians. So not only was what I saw in Poland rare and sort of unique for Poland, but it was very rare and unique for refugee resettlement in any context that I've ever observed as a journalist. And that became clear to me almost immediately, even before I got to Poland. So this photo was taken at Charles de Gaulle Airport where I had my layover. This woman was a nurse based in Cape Cod who told me that when the war broke out, she took leave from her job and she began fundraising and had pulled together thousands of dollars, which she equally distributed across these envelopes, some of which are in her hand. She was with a friend. They were planning to rent a car and go to the border between Ukraine and Poland and pass out cash to people crossing the border. They don't know anybody in either of these countries. They don't speak the language, but they were so moved by what they saw on television that they decided to pick up and leave. And I saw this all over the place. I saw this in hotels in Warsaw. I saw this in uh, facilities that the Polish government opened to take refugees in. People were willing to literally give the shirts off their back to the Ukrainian people in general based on what they had seen in the news and kind of the emotional reaction that they had to the situation. So these photos are taken at a bus stop where I spent a bus station, one of the bigger of um, of them in Warsaw, where I spent a couple of nights. And I sat there with volunteers from the tech industry, or with a group that began with people who worked in tech, and within a day of the war starting, created an algorithm so that they could, or created a program that allowed them to basically just type in, the information of Ukrainians crossing the border, their age, the number of people in their party, their gender, et cetera, and match them with Polish households who had agreed to take in strangers and let them live there. So that's what's happening on the photo that you see here on the right. This particular night I was there, there were people coming from Kharkiv, which was actively being bombed. And so people with absolutely no notice grabbed what they could, threw it into bags, some of which are like trash bags that you can see here are shopping bags, and showed up, literally looking shell shocked. I had never seen that before, but it's a literal expression. People's eyebrows are sort of fixed halfway up their faces, and they have no idea what to do, and they're very much in shock. And so they've got pets with them, they've got children with them. And at this bus stop, they were met with Ukrainians distributing housing, as I mentioned, hot food, cold food that could be taken with them for later. Therapists were on hand to offer counseling sessions. Free SIM cards were being distributed. SIM cards are critical, as you guys may know, for anybody who's crossing the border in a moment of crisis and wants to keep in touch with family members, because you can cross an international border and just completely lose your way of contacting your family. They were getting free taxi vouchers. They were getting dog food and dog treats. And I had to take this picture because I also have a dachshund, and I know I would also be very concerned about making sure that she had something to eat if I was forced to cross the border with her in an emergency. Next, I'll show you, these photos were taken in a large shelter that the Polish government opened. So not only were many, many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians taken into Polish households, but there were also these very large government-run shelters that were opened up. This one was in a stadium where the White Stripes once played, and basically the entire bottom floor of the stadium was turned into almost this mall of sorts. So you had, clothing, you had backpacks, you had bathing suits, you had towels and sheets and all different sizes, and socks and shoes, and appropriate attire for any type of weather you can imagine. And people were able to go downstairs daily and get clean clothes and clean underwear and clean socks. And actually, the volunteers working in this mall said to me, the biggest challenge that they had was that they were getting too many donations and it was overwhelming, and they needed more staff. They didn't need more donations. They needed more staff to process the donations because they were so overwhelming. This is another photo from inside the stadium. So you can see here all of these strollers and baby carriers that were donated by Polish people. The big room here where performances once took place had cots laid out, and this was a quiet area. in recognition of the fact that people arriving here were traumatized. So they asked everybody in this area to be quiet. This was for resting. There was a place to basically charge your devices and be with your family, but just kind of, this was a resting space. I also met, there was a daycare. These facilities each had their own daycares because, again, you've got to fill out paperwork, you've got to wait in line, there's a process. And so there was this consideration made of, well, let's watch people's children, because it's very hard to fill out all this paperwork and get signed up with the Polish government if you have, a baby or a 2-year-old hanging on you. So in the daycare at this particular facility, I met a mortgage broker from Denver who quit his job and rented an Airbnb and moved to Poland because he wanted to help people. He was so moved. And I just can't underscore how many people I met from other countries, a lot of Americans, but from all over the world, who just dropped everything to try to help Ukrainians. So you may have seen and heard this discussed in the early weeks of the war. And I think people who work full-time on refugee resettlement, the most optimistic of them just kept saying, we really hope that this will serve as a model for how mass displacement will be handled moving forward. And it was their sort of subtle and understated way of saying they work on refugee resettlement all the time, and this is not typical. And what would it look like for a response like this to exist in other parts of the world? When I think about the resources that I saw made available to Ukrainians, like, down to the dog treats for the dachshund, that reminds me of my own. I think they're resources that take into account the totality of the individuals who were forced to cross the border in an emergency. They're not people who just need the very basics, and they weren't treated as such, a place to sleep and edible slop and but they were treated as people with dogs and dietary preferences, not just sort of health and medical conditions, but there was a humanity to taking into consideration what would make people most comfortable, and what could be done, that to provide for them anything that any of us would like to have. Not that it makes up, again, for the experience of having to be forced from your home, but the Polish people and all those who arrived in Poland seem to be doing their best to just sort of treat people as they might want to be treated if they were forced into such a situation. Okay, so now we're going very far from Poland to another mass displacement that I personally spent a lot of time covering. So, as you all may know, during the Trump administration, for the first time in US history, we had what was essentially a refugee camp outside of the United States border. It started when the Supreme Court initially left in place a restriction on asylum that required people attempting to get legal status in the United States to wait out their cases in northern Mexico, and then continued and grew based on other restrictions that came after. So the first time I visited northern Mexico after this restriction came down, I went to this concrete plaza in the city of Matamoros, which has been in the news recently. You all may have seen that 4 Americans were kidnapped in Matamoros, 2 were killed. It's a very dangerous city. I ended up going back again and again, and just for context, each time I was there, I was closely monitored. There were people watching me for security purposes to make sure they knew of my whereabouts at all times, so that I wasn't going to be kidnapped. I was never allowed to spend the night in Matamoros. The New York Times required me to go and come back before sundown every day. I didn't bring security with me because that actually draws more attention to you as a foreigner and can put you at greater risk. But I had very specific routes that I was able to take. I wasn't allowed to go, beyond like 15 minutes from the border, basically, and everything had to be premeditated and planned because Matamoros has been effectively under cartel control for a very long time. So those are the precautions that I had to take just to go there for a few hours. And I was there to write about people who were suddenly being kept outside of the United States and were living outside, completely exposed to the elements and completely exposed to cartel violence with literally no protection at all. So in the early weeks and months, people had nothing. They slept outside on this concrete plaza. Sometimes you would have volunteer groups who would arrive when it was safe and distribute things like tents or distribute food, but it was by no means there on a daily basis. It was by no means some days safe food to eat, much less food that took into consideration people's health restrictions or preferences, of course. I mean, there was no such thing. And it was very, very, very hot. I mean, Matamoros gets extremely hot, and it's also right on the water. So in the evenings, it can get extremely cold, and people were exposed to the elements. So this is a little boy who, the day I was there, was vomiting, and he seemed to be sick from the heat, but also probably the food that he was eating. There were women who had given birth on this plaza, and no support for them because the Mexican government actually refused to even allow the UN to come in and bring supplies because the Mexican government didn't want to send the message that migrants were welcome to stay. They wanted people to leave and get out of the area. And so the thinking was, well, if we accommodate them and we make them comfortable, then they won't leave. And so as a result of that, almost nothing was provided. Again, volunteer groups, there were groups in South Texas that have been doing work to support migrants for a really long time that did their best. But there were days when it was too dangerous to enter the country. You know, I spent time this same day with a pastor who'd opened up a shelter in Matamoros, and he took me to it. And the shelter was specifically for women who'd given birth on the plaza because there were so many people. You know, all he could do was take in half a dozen at a time, people who were the most vulnerable. And so as we were driving, we passed a kind of a square where there were vendors just selling little stuff at tables very informally. And he basically said to me, this square is how I know if it's safe to enter Matamoros today. If I drive by and there are vendors outside selling stuff, I know that it's safe. And if I drive by and nobody's outside, I turn my car around and I go back into the United States because that means that there's some sort of conflict going on, that, you know, there are guns out and somebody's being pursued and it's not safe to be driving around at that time. And multiple times he'd been surrounded by people. He'd been held at gunpoint by people just wanting to know who he was and where he was going, and was basically let go because of his religious affiliations. But you know, this is a very dangerous place to even visit, is the point that I think I'm getting across, much less to live. So as I continued to return to Matamoros throughout the Trump administration, and I actually was there all the way up until Election Day. I went there on Election Day in 2020. The situation really metastasized. So the group living on that concrete plaza got so big that they moved over to a kind of field right along the river from which you could actually see the United States. And some supplies eventually made their way in, all from volunteer groups, again, not from the Mexican government. So additional tents were brought in, and big, what do you call those? Big tanks that collect rainwater, that was supposed to filter rainwater, were put out so that people could get water. And you know, they had to use buckets and carry their daily water back and forth every day. The filter system was not very good because people were constantly ill in Matamoros. I mean, I would be going around and doing interviews, and if I go back and listen to my audio from those reporting trips, what I hear is just constant coughing and even retching. Like I can hear people vomiting in the background because there was no way to practice safe hygiene. There were a few dozen porta potties that, you know, the smell was unbelievably bad. And there was just no way to sort of protect yourself from the elements and to keep illness from just getting passed around constantly within these camps because there were no resources to support it. So this is a baby that has a heat rash. I saw this a lot in Matamoros. This is a newborn, a baby that was born in the tent camp. I watched it get its first bath in a plastic bowl. This is a little girl who had a physical disability that her mother was hoping to have treated in the United States. These photos are people kind of doing their best to try to help keep kids entertained. So the one photo with the balloons you can see is at a birthday party. This kid really liked me for some reason, so he was sort of stuck to me all day. But parents would basically pool their money together and do what they could to buy 5 balloons for a birthday party and then try to like save them and blow them up again for the next birthday party, just to give kids a semblance of normalcy. The other photo that you see is a man who had been a musician and a music teacher in his home country. And so he was giving free music classes to a few kids just to kind of try to keep kids busy. But the children in this camp and many displaced children across the globe aren't going to school at all. There were kids in this camp who hadn't been to school in over a year. And now that we've, when I used to talk about this, it was more abstract, but now we've all lived through the pandemic and we all know very well how significant it is for kids who are developing intellectually to miss school for a month, much less to miss school for a whole year or longer. I mean, those are delays that, as we all heard, experts tell us, and can not ever be overcome in many cases. And so that's the case for many refugee children. So last person I'm going to introduce you to is Alex. He was an 11-year-old who I met in Matamoros. He loved animals. He loved science. He grew up in southern Mexico and had been, a nerd. His main thing was, I miss school. I love school. He even got really excited to show me a notebook that somebody had brought him from a religious group that came and did just kind of a finite period of classes for the kids. Nothing sanctioned, nothing official, but again, just something to help them sort of keep busy for a few days at a time. But it was his most recent schoolwork, and so he was really excited to show it off to me. I started asking him, is there anything that you like about your current life? Do you have anything that you like to do for fun? No, not really. Is there anywhere that you can go with your friends? And he said, no, we used to be able to go down by the river, and that was nice because you can get a breeze over there and a little bit of fresh air, but it's, my mom says it's not safe for us to go over there anymore. So he's basically stuck in this area, which was a few different tents crammed together all the time. Parents stopped letting their kids even leave the tent side because kidnappings were occurring. There were hundreds of documented cases of assaults and kidnappings and extortion cases. And so parents had to keep their kids really, really close. And so they're just sitting outside all day under the elements. When I started asking Alex's mom about how and why they ended up in this camp, she told me a familiar story, and she brought out photos to kind of show me as evidence. This happened a lot in Matamoros. It was kind of remarkable to see everybody had a few documents in their tent that were treated like gold. So if it rained, people would sprint inside to make sure that they were protected. It was the one thing that would be wrapped in blankets or shoes or whatever people could put these records in to try to protect them. And these are the documents that they plan to try to use to convince the US government that they deserved asylum. And so from Alex's mom, I heard about an uncle of his who had been kidnapped by a cartel and murdered, along with several other extended relatives. I heard about his father, who was physically abusive to his mom and the family, and how when she had tried to engage police, it became clear that the father had a relationship with the police and that the police were going to be of no use to the family. And in fact, the mother was even at even greater risk by trying to get the police involved. And as she's talking to me, I can hear Alex retching in the background. And I sort of paused her and said, is he okay? Do we need to stop for a minute? Do we need to go check on him? And she said, oh, no, don't worry. That happens whenever he hears me talk about, our life before. That happens whenever he hears me talk about his dad or our extended relatives. Don't worry about it. That was his trauma response from everything that he'd been through. And yeah, I just was not really ever able to forget meeting this family and this child who was very clearly living in circumstances that were exacerbating those that forced his family to flee home in the first place. So I know it's a very sad note to end on, but I wanted to share these examples so that you guys have a better sense of, what the different experiences of displacement can look like, and how choices made by elected officials, which of course are influenced by people like us, um, really make a huge impact. All refugees are not created equally, and there are very, very big differences that exist in the trajectory of one's life following displacement based on access to these very, very clear categories of support. Do you have housing? Do you have education? Do you have a job? And are you able to live safely? So that's my presentation. No, it's kind of a weird one to clap after, and I'm always a bummer. So I really appreciate you guys being here. I'm gonna. Okay. Okay.
Hi, I'm Neha. You mentioned this a bit at lunch already today, but I was struck in this last story about the child's response to the questioning and the story, like retelling of the story. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you handle not re-traumatizing folks as you're asking to share these stories, like what tactics you use as a journalist in your questions and in your approach to engaging with people, particularly in a context like this where it's not clear what the next step is for a lot of these families. And so a lot of it is reflective on where they've come from and kind of this nature of being stuck.
That's a great question. And that's exactly why I tried to stop our interview and say, like, Mom, are you sure we should be doing this right now? Do you want to take a pause? And her reaction really struck me because she said, don't worry, let's just keep going. And my job is to follow her lead, but basically what I did was continue the conversation kind of in hushed tones off to the side. So Alex couldn't hear us anymore. Thankfully, now there are lots of trauma informed reporting techniques and classes and trainings that you can take. And so I tend to call on those resources quite a bit. I mean, in general, it basically involves letting people know far in advance that you want to interview them and what you'd like to interview them about, letting them know that they can set boundaries throughout the conversation. So, and I kind of remind people throughout the conversation of that as well. If I hit on something that you don't want to answer, you can let me know. It's not going to hurt my feelings. I won't feel bad at all. Just let me know and we'll move on. No big deal. I talk to people that they have relationships with in advance. If they have a lawyer, if they have a mental health professional, I bring those people in advance and seek guidance from them. Really just try to go slow and follow people's leads and be okay with hearing no. That's such an important part of being a reporter. Sometimes the person who you want to interview more than anybody else in the world just does not want to talk to you, and that is their right. And so one of the things that I had to learn very early was it's okay if I get a no in response to an interview request, or, if I hit a boundary that I really feel like if I had this vivid detail, it would make my story so much better. But if somebody doesn't want to go there, it's their story. So it's kind of just about being okay with hearing no. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm Tiago. I work for UNHCR in Colombia. And I think it was a great comparison that you made between these different refugee crises. And I think there are some other crises that are much less visible, like the internal displacements crisis, especially in countries that don't draw that much attention, but people may have the same level of suffering or even more than some refugee crisis, right? And I was wondering, I wanted to know more, what's your vision on the role of the media in showcasing this crisis, and also your role as a journalist showcasing this crisis, right? Because I don't know if you have the vision of, if you showcases a crisis, it may bring more attention to that crisis and more resources to go into the needs of the people in that situation, and also on the ways of showcasing how they should be dealing with that situation, right? I think a recent example has been the Darien crisis. The Darien crisis, like, of course, Darien has been going for a long time now. The forest in Panama, where people are crossing to get to the United States, and I think it was in the end of last year and the beginning of this year that this situation draw a lot of attention that I think before it wasn't that much present in the media, but because of the media has picked up this story and picked up the situation that was going on in the Darien, I think the crisis became much more visible, and now people are talking about the struggle that people have been going through the Darien. So wanted to hear more your views on how the media can help the humanitarian actors and the help to bring some relief to these emergencies.
Mhm. I do think that we have a responsibility to cover any major crisis. I mean, it's hard to answer the question sort of clearly and cleanly of what constitutes a story, what should be covered and what shouldn't be covered. Um, I tend to think generally, and I talk to journalism students about kind of this inverse relationship between the scale of harm or the scale of significance and the number of people involved. Because if a story impacts millions of people, but in a very small way, it might still be a really important story to tell. And inversely, if the story has life or death consequences, but it only impacts one person, that story might still be worth telling. The Darien Gap is a story that impacts hundreds of thousands of people and has life or death consequences. You know, for almost all of them, it's incredibly dangerous. So I think that's a story absolutely that, you know, we have a responsibility to cover. I also tend to think when it comes to the role of journalists in covering displacement and migration in general, about the importance of history and context. That's kind of my thing that I keep going back to and I keep preaching and I keep mentioning to as many people as possible. Because especially during the Trump era, there were lots of people who were being assigned to immigration stories or who wanted to cover immigration stories because it was this big national story all of a sudden, but who weren't as familiar with the history. And so that's why this is exactly what I'm sort of trying to do here today by saying, you know, yes, I went to Poland and I covered what became the largest mass displacement in the world at that time. But let's recall that the global refugee crisis is nothing new. And let's compare what's happening in Poland to what's happening in other places, because immigration is such an emotional issue. And it often gets covered in a vacuum in a way that can end up being really misleading and really damaging. So you might have seen, you know, coverage of the overwhelming generosity of Polish people in response to Ukrainians and have no idea what was happening in Belarus. And in fact, that was probably the case if you know, I'm not talking about you specifically, who are obviously an expert on this issue, but one who came across a story written in a vacuum about how wonderful it was that, you know, millions of Ukrainians were being welcomed with open arms into Poland, might have no idea that the story was completely different when it came to Arab migrants trying to cross over from Belarus. And so I think these stories are really important to cover. And I also think it's really important that we do our research, we know our history, and we know our context, so that you know, we're taking every opportunity that we can to educate people broadly, not just about the one thing that's kind of got the world's attention, but about other places like the Darien Gap, which I don't think were ignored, but it took a while for journalists to get there and to cover it. And now there's a lot of attention being paid to the Darien Gap. So, and what did that take? Like 3 years, 2 years maybe, to the point where people who aren't super interested in migration might actually hear that and know immediately what region you're talking about and why it's important.
I think I remember this kind of loud reading in your Atlantic piece about your trip to Poland. Your trip to Poland. I think there was a part, and I read it a while ago, so I'm sorry if I'm getting it wrong, but I think just a bit of a question of when it comes to solidarity with like big mass movements of people, that there seems to be this global trend of like there's a lot of solidarity, but like as the months go on, there's still a need for housing or job support or other community support and resources. But like patience or solidarity kind of runs thin, and I guess resentment or xenophobia can rise. And I'm wondering, like, since your trip to Poland, if you've seen any changing sentiments when it comes specifically with Ukrainian refugees, of I guess this like greater trend that's appeared in different movements of people. Like Syrian refugees, for instance, or different movements of refugees into the US. If you're seeing any of that, I guess, shifting from solidarity to maybe perhaps xenophobia happening, yeah, with this particular movement of people.
So that was already just a few weeks into the war, a big part of the coverage that I didn't mention today, but that I did in Poland, because I was hearing people say things like, um, yeah, I was having people ask me, can you ask them when they're going to leave? Like I would go to the hosts I would go to a host who had taken in Ukrainians, and I would interview them, and then I would go and interview the Ukrainians, and the host would say like, can you try to find out when they're leaving? The patience was wearing thin, and people were getting exhausted, and the UNHCR was a great help to me in terms of um, sharing that this is very common, and that it's happened worldwide. And so I do think that patience was running thin in Ukraine. I haven't seen it evolving into xenophobia in the way that it has elsewhere. And it's kind of, I mean, it is noteworthy and interesting because I kept hearing in Poland how prior to the war, it's not as if the two cultures and societies were thought of as equal. I mean, there's obviously shared ties in some places, shared language and shared cultural norms, but it was actually the case that, Ukrainians, to the extent that they lived in Poland, tended to do domestic work, tended to do, low-paying immigrant labor, and were viewed lower on a societal hierarchy. And so it's interesting that you haven't seen evolution toward xenophobia against Ukrainians, but there was this exhaustion. There was this just, okay, we kind of want to get back to regular life, and we can't host guests forever. I think that might have been the headline of my story. You can't host guests forever, because I kept hearing that people were venting to me. Even at one point, I was in a cab, wasn't even doing an interview, and I think my cab driver, who was a woman in her 60s, she heard me speaking English and kind of guessed that I was a journalist, and she started venting to me about how she needed to get these Ukrainians out of her house, and she was just she felt bad, but she was exhausted by their presence. And so I think what becomes really critical when that exhaustion it starts to hit, is those other metrics of security and stability that I mentioned. So, if you're no longer welcome in somebody's home, do you have access to welfare benefits? Do you have access to government housing? Do you have, is your kid enrolled in school, or are you just being kicked out onto the street? So I think that insulation and that support lessened the pressure on Polish people, because Ukrainians were eligible for cash benefits. So it's not like all of the groceries had to come out of the pocket of their Polish host. Maybe if the Polish host wanted them out of the house, but was willing to throw a little bit of money toward rent each month, that plus cash benefits, plus whatever job, a Ukrainian person was legally entitled to get and therefore was receiving minimum wage, maybe that together covers housing. So I feel like that's part of why the pressure was less. And I don't mean to ignore the elephant in the room, because so often when I talk about this, people are like, isn't it just race? And obviously race is a really big factor. And religion is a really big factor when we're talking about Poland specifically. So, we're talking about xenophobia. Obviously, when you're talking about two communities that are white and that look really similar, there's the Ukrainians were sort of at an advantage, so to speak, in that regard. But I think also and perhaps that explains the extra support that they got from the Polish government. But I think that support itself also just kind of lessens the pressure on everybody and makes them want to be more generous and not just give out, nasty slop to eat, but oat milk and, decaf coffee and things that we all love to have and want to have in that situation. Did you want to ask one more? You're good. Okay. Thank you so much for coming, guys.